Steelhead trout, a fish that live in the streams in North America. So in order to increase the number of this steelhead trout, captive breeding has occurred since the year 1992. So the fish eggs and sperms are mixed and the young fish grow in a large tanks, and these tanks are aerated water. Aerated means you pump in the air to the water to oxygenate the water to provide more oxygen to the fish. So for the first year of their lives, so they grow in the large tanks, which is aerated. Most are then released to the wild. However, a few male and female fish are kept to become the parents of the next generation of captive bred fish. Okay, so each tank may hold up to 50,000 fish, and the young captive fish are fed processed food. Some young fish are unable to survive these conditions, and a proportion die. So death is usually the result of two main things. One is poor wound healing after accidents because of overcrowding. And secondly is due to the spread of diseases. So this is the information provided to us. Okay, so question asks, name the expected pattern of variation in wound healing ability in the population of fish. Okay, so pattern of variation. So remember the word variation. So how many types or how many pattern of variation you have learned in your syllabus? There are only two, right? It's either continuous or discontinuous variation. So in this example here, they're asking you whether it's continuous or discontinuous variation. So this is a variation in wound healing ability. So when you want to measure wound healing ability, what do you measure? Is it a quantitative or a qualitative data that you're going to get? Right? So wound healing means usually you look at how long does it take, which is actually the timing. Okay, time taken for the wound to heal. So if it's talking about timing, time is actually quantitative. Quantitative. So if it's quantitative, then you know that whether it's continuous or discontinuous. It is continuous because your phenotypic variation is continuous. So the value is continuous. So therefore, it is a continuous variation. So it's a very, very good question to test your understanding, okay, of these two variations. Next, name the process that results in improved survival of captive fish in second, third, and subsequent generation of captive bred fish. So that means you capture the fish and you allow them to multiply and you feed them with processed food. Okay, you allow them to multiply and from generations to generations, right? So they ask you what is the name for the process where the survival of the fish is improved. That means the fish must have adapted to the two problems that they have faced in captive breeding, right? The two problems here, number one is the wound healing ability, and the second is the resistant to the spread of the diseases. That means they get the infection, but they do not have got symptoms, signs and symptoms, so they do not get sick. So that means as we grow the captive bred fish through different generations, there is an improvement in wound healing as well as resistance to diseases. So what is the name of this process? Where there is a shift in the gene pool, shift in the phenotype of the whole population from poor wound healing and not resistant to become better wound healing and resistant. So can you see this is a directional selection here? So this is what kind of process. So you learn that there are three main processes that you learn that can lead to a change in gene pool population. Remember, the first one is natural selection, and the second one is selective breeding, which is also called artificial selection, and the third one is the genetic drift. Under genetic drift, we have got bottleneck effect. Okay. Bottleneck effect, and also the founder effect. Right? So you have learned two of them, founder effect and also bottleneck effect. So these are the three processes in this chapter they've learned that can lead to change in the phenotype, the genotype, the gene pool of a population through time. So based on the data given, what is the name of the process that results in improved survival of the captive fish in second, third, and subsequent generation? The answer here is, there are two answers that are given here that are correct. Number one is selective breeding, because this whole process is a selective breeding. But during the selective breeding, we actually did not do a selection. That means we did not go and select, okay, this fish has got better wound healing, and this fish is more resistant to disease. Therefore, we choose and make them. So we did not do this. We allow the fish to grow in the tank, and whichever fish that survive, we continue to grow them. So therefore, it can also be said as a natural selection, because we didn't really go and select fishes which got better wound healing and resistance. So therefore, natural selection is also a correct answer. But they also accept selective breeding or artificial selection, because in this process, we are growing it in the tank. It's not in the nature. So therefore, we also accept if this process is called selective breeding as well as artificial selection. Okay? Question B, suggest and explain. So keyword is suggest and explain. 3 ways in which the tank environment may make the phenotype of a captive fish different from the wild fish. So you know that any changes in the population phenotype with time is due to the selection pressure. Remember, whenever a selection pressure exists in the population, so this is a population, and then depending on what they are exposed to in the environment, what they're exposed to in the environment, that becomes your selection pressure that will immediately divide the population into 2 groups, right? So first group has got favorable phenotype, genotype, and allele, and second group is unfavorable. So these are all the favorable phenotype, genotype, and allele. Okay, and this one is the unfavorable. So this is how the selection will happen. So they are asking you this tank environment here, which is actually the selection pressure, which leads to what kind of favorable phenotype here, which is given in the question, is the wound healing ability. That means time taken for wound healing, as well as the resistance to disease. So favorable phenotype is ability to heal as well as resistant to disease have been selected. So what kind of selection pressure has led to this phenotype becomes favorable? That's the question. So then this is the environment in the fish tank. Okay, so what are the environments? So just list all the environment that you can see in the question, and that will be correct. So first thing, they tell you that they water aerate the place. So that means more oxygen. Okay, so more oxygen will lead to what phenotype in the fish? This one is they become bigger. More oxygen, more aerobic respiration, more ATP, so more ATP for growth. Okay, so they may actually grow bigger. There's more oxygen. And then overcrowding. So overcrowding is the condition they say it leads to wound healing. Overcrowding, it leads to more accidents, and I'll say accidents among the fish, okay, hitting into each other as they swim and therefore leading to wound cuts, okay, from the fin. So leading to more wound, okay. And overcrowding also can lead to easier spread of diseases. So these are all marked as the same marking point because they're asking for the environmental factor. So overcrowding is already one environmental factor. What phenotype it leads to. So you have to talk about environmental factor, and also you have to talk about the phenotype. Okay, the phenotype. So that gives the components of a marking point. Okay. So they also say they feed with processed food. Processed food is also the environmental factor. So maybe processed food will lead to, depending on the processed food content, so whether the processed food got more protein, will lead to more muscle formation, right? So if the processed food has got more lipids, then it will lead to more fat formation in the fish. So the fish becomes more fatty, or the fish becomes more meaty, okay, depending on the content or the nutrients of the food, okay. And one more point here is the color, the background color of the fish tank. So background color of the fish tank may link to skin color. Okay, skin color means that usually the color of the fish, right, must be very well camouflaged with the color of the environment, so that it's not so easy to be seen by predator. So this could be a condition that leads to the fish naturally will actually phenotype, will adapt to this particular color. Okay, so think of all the environmental conditions given to you in the questions, and for this environmental condition, what kind of phenotype is being promoted or supported or selected or well adapted. Okay, so it's a very good question to apply your knowledge to answer the question. Okay. Many of the differences in gene expression between the offsprings of the wild and the captive, between the offspring of the wild and captive, so you're comparing between wild and captive, okay. So comparing between wild and captive fish, differences in the gene expression, okay, were in the genes coding for proteins involved in the immune response, as well as in gene coding for proteins involved in wound healing. So the differences between these two groups of fish, one is in the wild and the other one is in captive bred, mainly is the gene that code for proteins in immune response and wound healing. So the fish from captive bred parents express these genes to a greater degree. So captive bred fish will express the gene, more of this gene for immune response and wound healing. The researchers concluded that the differences were inherited and adaptive. So what do you mean by inherited and adaptive? That means they are really testing your understanding of these two words. So instead of asking you to define these two words, they ask you to explain these two words, relate the inherited, relate the scenario that they've shown you in the passage to these two terms. So this is a more higher order thinking question, really, not so direct as define this term, okay? So let's see if you can do them or not. Explain why the researcher concluded that the differences in gene expression between the two groups of fish were inherited. So why the differences between the two groups of fish are said to be inherited? Basically, they're asking you, why is it the captive bred fish improvement in immune response and wound healing is due to, it is inherited? That's the question, okay? So in order to understand this question, you come back to this chapter's main topic, which is revolving around natural selection and evolution. So go back to the format of natural selection. Then from there, retrieve the answer from what you know, okay? So natural selection, remember, we say that you've got a group of population and subjected to the selection pressure from the environment, okay? So the selection pressure from the environment that acts on it and will cause a change in the phenotype, genotype, and allele of this population, because the selection pressure will choose organism which is the fittest to survive. So that's why we have divided the group into two groups of organisms, the fittest and the less fit. So the fittest organisms survive and reproduce. So keywords, this organism here, right, with favorable, this group with favorable phenotype, genotype, and gametes, favorable, okay? Keyword survive, keyword reproduce, pass the favorable allele to the offsprings. So these are all the keywords. So therefore, it leads to a change in the gene pool, allele frequency. So change in the phenotype, okay, into a group that has got better wound healing ability and more resistant to the disease. But this is a 1-mark question. How so? From the basic that you learn, how do you write your answer to score that? Okay, so the improve in wound healing and improve in immune response is inherited. So look at the entire format. Where does it show there's inheritance? And what you need to write. Okay, so first thing is you need to say that you need to talk about the selection pressure of the tank. So when the parental, captive bred parents, when the parental fish, they are grown in the fish tank where it's overcrowded and promote the spread of diseases. So that is the environment that the parents are in. This selection pressure will favor the selection of better wound healing and disease-resistant phenotype, and therefore genotype, and therefore allele to survive and reproduce. So that's the first marking point. You talk about the selection pressure, what is it? And therefore, what is the phenotype that has got selective advantage? Okay, so talk about the selection pressure, which phenotype with selective advantage, and therefore you talk about, so those parents with this phenotype will survive and reproduce. Okay, and therefore producing offspring which has got more offsprings with wound healing and better immune response. So that's the answer. So that means you're telling me inherited means how does it pass from parent to offspring? So first you must say that it is the selection pressure that choose the parent with this phenotype, and the parents survive and reproduce, and therefore the parent pass those favorable alleles to the offspring, and therefore the phenotype this type of phenotype will increase. Okay, so that is to cover the meaning of the word inherited, means from parents to offspring. How does it occur? Now, the next question is they ask you, okay, so explain why the researcher concluded that the differences is due to adaptive. Adaptive means what? Remember, selective advantage. You learn that why this group is selected is because they have got selective advantage. Selective advantage, or they are selected for survival. So this is actually an adaptive feature of the organism. So when they ask you to describe adaptive, so that means the fish has got certain characteristics that allow it to adapt to the immediate selection pressure, and so they survive. So what are the phenotypes that allow them to adapt? Adapt means, what is a phenotype? And therefore they are selected by selection pressure. The selection pressure select which phenotype. So that phenotype allow them to adapt to the environment, and therefore they can survive. So they adapt to the selection pressure to survive. So what feature allows them to adapt? What phenotype allows them to adapt? So you need to focus on the phenotype. So the phenotype is captive bred fish. Okay, they have better wound healing as well as immune response. So this is the characteristic or the phenotype that allows them to adapt to the fish tank environment. Okay, so this is a very, very good question that applies your knowledge, really tests your understanding of these two words. So this is really, really good question. When you study your PowerPoint notes as well as the textbook, you need to pay attention to a certain word and you need to understand the meaning of the word. So that's the effort that you need to put in. Why do they use this word? What does it mean by this word? You have to do that because the question I can ask. Okay.